The deserts of the American Southwest are full of stories. The ancient history of the successive other worlds that created this landscape is scrawled in a language of stone across the towering bluffs. This geology tells of the rise and fall of enormous sand dunes that once advanced upon a shallow sea, and of their host of desert wanderers who left nothing but traces in their wake on their solemn journeys across the sands. What forces drove the dramas now locked in the cliffs that stand silent vigil over the valleys below? Look closely into the rock, and it will tell you about the power of wind, of water, and of sand. The cliffs of Ghost Ranch, New Mexico are one of the most iconic features of this region. The rust-red Chinle Formation at their base holds the remains of thousands of late Triassic creatures from an ecosystem exploding with bizarre biodiversity. But that's a story for another day. Overlying the Chinle is a thick slab of tan yellow rock that makes up a majority of these towering cliffs. A geologic formation known as the Entrada Sandstone. The Entrada Sandstone dates back over 164 million years to the Middle Jurassic period. At that time, northern New Mexico was part of a massive dune sea that extended into Arizona, Utah, and Colorado, bordered on its south by volcanic uplands. How do we know this? When looking at the Entrada Sandstone, you might notice that the beds are composed of strikingly large sweeping structures, resembling gigantic fish scales. To geologists, this pattern speaks volumes. To understand what these sedimentary structures actually mean, we need look no further than our own modern world. In geology, there's a principle popularized by 16th and 17th century geologists James Hutton and Charles Lyell that says that the present is the key to the past. In order to understand what processes created the rock beneath our feet, we need to understand how our dynamic Earth functions today. And right here in New Mexico exists the unique opportunity to watch a dune sea's story unfolding in real time. White Sands National Park, a shimmering jewel in the Tularosa Basin. This is a true dune sea, with blinding white sand made of evaporative gypsum salt from Permian Age rocks in the mountains nearby. When walking this blindingly bright landscape on a calm day, it might seem static, the only movement made by heat waves dancing over the sand. But this is an illusion. If you journey out into White Sands on a windy day, when the sky dims with flying sand, the life within the dunes on which you tread is revealed. Looking closely at the ground, every grain of sand takes on a life of its own, creeping forward or even leaping under the influence of the wind. As the sand moves, ripples are formed, microcosms of the larger dunes on which they sit. Over time, the sand moves up the back or stoss side and down the front or lee side of the dunes. It's for this reason that sand dune crests run perpendicular to the prevailing wind direction in the area. The wind is what creates and powers them. When parts of the dune crests are piled with this moving sand, they become unstable. You can see a similar process when you step onto the lee side of a dune. The area under your foot gives way, and the collapsing sand begins to collectively flow like a liquid. When this happens with pileups of wind-blown sediment, a portion of the dune begins to collapse. These sediment gravity flows roll down the front side of the dunes, indicating their movement in real time. In the moment, these grain flows seem to lurch forward, like some ancient creature waking from sleep. Over longer spans of time, the process of traveling sand causes the army of dunes to march a surprising 9 meters or 30 feet per year. If you leave the dunes for too long, you might return to a completely changed landscape. This is the cycle of a dune sea. The grain flows that continuously roll down the front side of the dunes can be seen mostly solidified between dunes, and they are exactly what creates the huge sweeping structures in the cliffs of the Entrada Sandstone. By looking at their shape and orientation, we can tell that this area of the expansive mid-Jurassic dune field was moving roughly westward, pushed onwards by wind just like modern dunes. Their size was also immense, with the dunes towering to around 50 meters tall. We find dune structures like these, called aeolian crossbeds due to their ties with the wind, in dunes throughout the Earth's history, and even when exploring other planets like Mars. The dunes of White Sands are a desolate environment, and yet life persists here. Fauna unique to the Tularosa Basin flourishes in this harsh landscape. During the day, the air is baking hot, and many creatures, like this stark white species of earless lizard, take refuge by burrowing into the comparably cool sand. The wanderers of the desert trek across the dunes, leaving only trackways behind them. At the mercy of whipping wind and airborne sand, most traces of the dunes' inhabitants are quickly wiped away, the dunes renewed for the next generation to leave their own tracks in the sand. But sometimes, this cycle of footprint mosaics being wiped clean to start again is interrupted, and the marks left behind by life in the dunes linger on for us to find. This is also evident in the Entrada Sandstone. Because the sandstones of the Entrada are very porous, water seeps in and destroys most animal remains that might otherwise have been preserved. Only a single vertebrate skeleton has so far been found in the Entrada, one of a few rare terrestrial vertebrate fossils found anywhere in the mid-Jurassic of North America. This lonely skeleton is the tiny Entradasuchus. This 20-centimeter long crocodiliform was found in eastern Utah, and unlike modern semi-aquatic crocodilians, this croc was a little desert hunter, chasing bugs like the lizards of White Sands today. We may not have much, but this ancient desert did leave us other hints of its inhabitants. In some parts of the Entrada, traces of animals moving over the dunes or burrowing into them are commonplace, disrupting the well-defined crossbeds of the dunes. In order for these trace fossils to preserve, the help of another natural component is often needed: water. In dune fields, water left by the occasional bit of rainfall or fog dampens the sand, making its surface more cohesive. Tracks and burrows left in the damp sand are able to retain their shape much better before being buried by wind-blown sediment than they would dry, giving us a glimpse into the hidden ecosystem of these Middle Jurassic dunes. In parts of Utah, tiny trails and burrows made by invertebrates like beetles, spiders, and scorpions show us that these groups, like today, flourished on the Entrada dune field. larger burrows of small vertebrates like sphenodontian reptiles, and our own distant mammalian ancestors are also found here. These larger burrows show collapses at their openings, where dry sand at the surface more easily lost its shape compared to sand moistened by a high water table inside the burrow itself. The Entrada Dunes were also home to larger desert wanderers. Trackways of bipedal theropod dinosaurs, large and small, litter the ancient dunes. In some places, you can even see where their footfalls caused small avalanches of sand to roll down the lee side of a dune. We also find some of the earliest known evidence of the giant North American sauropods that would become famous and extremely diverse in the later Jurassic Morrison Formation. One lone trackway in the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument of Utah recounts a day when one of these behemoths strode across coastal sand reworked from the dunes. Perhaps it was utilizing a high water table to find life-giving fresh water flowing out of the dunes, much like large animals that cope with arid conditions today. Or perhaps it was simply easier to move along the coast than traversing the dunes themselves for a creature of this size, and it was simply passing through. Based on the fact that animals this large were inhabiting the area, on top of trackways being preserved at all, we're able to discern that this region received enough life-giving rain to sustain such a variety of life forms on its dunes. Many generations of life made the Entrada Sand Sea their home, but it was not immune to large-scale change. When you look toward the top of the Entrada Sandstone at Ghost Ranch, you can see that the yellow sandstones disappear, with another sort of rock taking their place. This more gray-colored rock unit is known as the Tidilto Limestone, and it indicates a whole new force taking hold on the Entrada Dune field: the power of the sea. During the Middle Jurassic, a large, shallow sea, known as the Sundance Sea, laid to the north of the Entrada Sandstone dunes. The Aeolian sandstones being overlain by a layer of this limestone at Ghost Ranch and other sites across the western US suggests that local sea levels rose enough to swallow the dunes entirely. Even dunes as large as these can be destabilized, and we see direct evidence of this in the upper bounds of the Entrada at Ghost Ranch, where distinct uneven scours separate the more structured dunes and piles of reworked sandstone of the exact same composition as the layers below, but with none of their structure. These scours recount especially dramatic events that occurred at Ghost Ranch. As sea levels rose to meet the dunes, the tides began to wear away at the ones closest to shore, causing them to become increasingly unstable. Then, one fateful day, that instability became too much, and whole portions of the dunes began to collapse in a process much like the smaller-scale sediment gravity flows that normally occur during dune movement, but on a much larger scale. These incidents, known more broadly as mass wasting events, are extremely dangerous to people who encounter them on unstable hillsides today. As sea levels continue to rise at a relatively rapid pace, more substantial sections of the dunes continue to collapse beneath the waves in underwater turbidity currents, filling in low areas between dunes with reworked, structureless sand. With that, the geology transitions into the Tidilto Limestone, burying the underlying Entrada Sandstone for good. Gypsum-filled limestones and huge evaporipe lenses, indicative of exposure to the air, suggest that local sea levels subsequently began to retreat once more, but the damage was already done. Just as an individual dune is a transient structure on the landscape, so too was the Entrada Dune Sea itself. Although this was the end of the Entrada, the story of the landscapes of western North America continued on with all of the grandeur of the rise and fall of these dunes. Some creatures that called the dunes home left legacies that persisted long after the dunes were gone, producing lineages that would capture the imaginations of millions of people all over the world. Over 160 million years after the Entrada dunes were deposited, we are still learning more and more about the processes that create the structures we see in the geology around us, and how to read the stories they tell about Earth's past in more detail than ever before. At Ghost Ranch, one of these tales is etched into the cliffs for anyone who passes by to see. One that brings to mind tiny armored crocodile relatives kicking up sand as they dart to and fro, and reverberates with the sound of sand on the wind over the tides of a steadily approaching sea.